Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Back to Ashes. My name is Phoenix. To the elite, the love comes back to you tenfold. If you are new to the channel and you begin to like what you are hearing and you support non-AI channels, please hit that subscribe and that bell notification to all so you'll be reminded of every time I upload a video. And while you're at it, if you'd like, please leave a like and comment. It lets the algorithm know that you like the video. With that being said, it is now time to go back to ashes. With that being said, sit back, relax, kick back, grab a snack, or tuck in and get warm, and prepare for your dose of vocal melatonin entitled True Creepy Trucker Stories. Right after this intro, there will be an ad. Right after the first story, there will be an ad. And after that, there will be no more ads within this video. I'm a mechanic these days, but back in 2009, I made my living behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. The pay was steady, far better than patching exhausts and swapping out gearboxes, so I stuck with the long hauls. My regular routes cut through the South, mostly Texas into Arkansas, and after enough trips, the highway felt almost familiar, like it recognized the sound of my engine. That fall, I took a solo load out of Amarillo, headed for Little Rock. My birthday was that weekend, and I'd promised my little sister I'd make it home for a quiet meal and her famously cooked carrot cake. I was eager to get there. My usual driving partner, Nate, had walked away from the job just days earlier. He'd muttered something about not handling the night runs anymore, but his real reason stayed unspoken. On our final trip together, he'd kept stealing glances at the side mirrors, tense, as though expecting trouble to appear behind us. When I finally asked, he gave a strained chuckle and said, "You'll find out soon enough." I let it drop. Everyone carries their own baggage. The run began like any other. I rolled out of Amarillo as the sun dipped low, skies clear and traffic thin. I grabbed coffee and a questionable hot dog at a convenience store, figuring I'd cross into Arkansas before the clock struck 12 if things stayed smooth. Around 8:45, somewhere deep in Oklahoma, past Eric, I spotted him. My dashboard lights were acting up again, flickering from a bad connection I kept meaning to repair, but I caught the figure in the sweep of my headlight. A man stood motionless on the shoulder, facing the road, not thumbing for a ride, not moving at all. He wore a heavy brown overcoat, old-fashioned, the kind with a wide collar. The bottom edge, dark and wet. My beams should have lit his face, but it stayed swallowed in shadow, like the darkness refused to let go. I eased off the gas just a touch, some deep instinct urging caution. He didn't seem to need assistance. He seemed to be expecting something. I called it in, possible pedestrian at mile marker 197, no car nearby. Dispatch promised to alert the highway patrol. I told myself he was just another wanderer, maybe intoxicated or disoriented, and kept rolling. 10 minutes down the road, he appeared again. Same coat, same rigid posture, but now on the opposite side of the interstate. The highway there was flat and straight. No interchanges, no turns, no median crossing that I could have missed. Even on foot, no one covers that distance so quickly. My pulse picked up. I switched off the radio. The crackling between tracks had grown unbearable, and the quiet felt oddly protective. Another half hour or so passed before I pulled into a familiar rest area. Basic setup. Vending machines, a restroom block, a broken payphone, and one other rig parked far back, dark and still. driver probably sleeping. I parked beneath the single buzzing overhead light and headed inside to freshen up. The fluorescent bulbs hummed and dipped as I entered, but I brushed it off as old electrical work. I bent over the sink, studied my reflection, pale bloodshot eyes, looking more hollow than merely tired, and turned on the cold tap. Water hit my face, and then everything went black. Total darkness, no gradual fade. I stood rigid, droplets falling from my chin, straining to hear anything over my own heartbeat. Footsteps, heavy boots on tile, measured and unhurried. Approaching from the hallway behind me, I assumed it was the other driver and called out, "Occupied." Silence. The stops continued, closer, stopping just beyond the doorway. I couldn't bring myself to turn. My hands were shaky. The air felt thick. After a few agonizing seconds, the lights snapped back on with their usual flicker. The hallway was empty. I didn't linger. I strode out, keys ready, skipping the vending machines entirely. When I reached my truck and yanked open the door, I froze. On the passenger side seat, always kept clear, part of my routine for a tidy cab, lay a brown wool coat. Damp. It reeked of mildew and old cigarette smoke. The smell of forgotten, waterlogged places. The seat cushion was warm, as though someone had only just left it. I slammed the door, the whole rig shuddering, climbed behind the wheel, and drove. I didn't stop until I crossed the state line and saw the familiar Waffle House beacon. I pulled in, checked the seat again. Nothing. No coat, no odor. The upholstery cool and undisturbed. I stayed parked under the bright lights, doors locked, engine idling, watching every mirror until dawn crept up. I never closed my eyes. That was my last run on that Oklahoma stretch. When I got back, I told dispatch I was done with it. No explanation needed. I suspect Nate had encountered the same thing and simply couldn't put words to it. I've logged thousands more miles since, witnessed plenty of oddities out there, but that night lingers. Even now, pulling into a quiet rest stop after dark, I sometimes hear those deliberate footsteps in my memory, catch that faint musty scent on the air, and when my gaze drifts to the empty passenger seat, the chill still finds me. During my first half year as a truck driver, I'm convinced I aged several years. The first couple of months especially felt like I was just trying to stay afloat. Everything they taught us in CDL school sounded good in theory, but it felt like it had been written by someone who had never actually driven a rig in real life. You can read manuals and watch training videos all day long, but none of that prepares you for the moment when you're trying to back a 53-foot trailer into a crowded truck stop, fuel island, at 2 a.m. with a line of impatient drivers behind you. I probably burned through close to 100 gallons of fuel just practicing backing up in empty parking lots. I'd usually do it late at night too, when nobody was around to see me sweating and messing it up over and over again. Even now, after years of experience, I still feel my chest tighten whenever I see a delivery spot that looks a little too cramped. To say the learning curve was steep would be putting it mildly. By my third week on the job, I'd already made a costly mistake. I forgot to crank my landing gear all the way up. That little oversight ended with a damaged trailer and an $800 deductible coming out of my pocket. I also learned very quickly that the 11-hour driving limit is not something you can treat casually. One night, I was pushing the limit hard. My clock was sitting at 10 hours and 59 minutes, and I convinced myself I could stretch it just a little further, maybe another 45 minutes, so I could make it home. About 20 minutes later, I started seeing the reflectors along the white line wobbling and dancing in front of me. That scared me enough to pull off into a Walmart parking lot where I passed out and slept like a corpse for 8 straight hours. Long-haul trucking is maybe 20% learning how to operate the truck and 80% learning how to survive living inside it. Those early months were rough, but somewhere around the 4th or 5th month, things began to fall into place. I figured out a sleep schedule that worked for me, splitting my rest between a 5-hour block and a 6-hour bunk nap. Eventually, things like chaining up in snowstorms or dealing with four-wheelers who treat the left lane like their personal property started to feel routine. It was exhausting, humbling work, but it was also strangely addictive. There's something satisfying about realizing you're finally getting good at something that terrified you just weeks earlier. I remember one particular run when it suddenly hit me. This was the life I wanted. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. During those early days, I made a few serious mistakes. One of them almost cost me my life. One morning, I was driving through Oregon, not long after crossing the Idaho state line on Interstate 84. It was one of those typical Pacific Northwest mornings. Gray skies, damp air, endless miles of quiet highway stretching out ahead. Out there in the middle of nowhere, it was just me, the road, my radio, and a flask of go juice to keep me awake. Everything was calm until I noticed a vehicle coming up behind me at a ridiculous speed. As it closed the distance, I realized it was a black Chevy pickup with dark tinted windows and no visible markings. It fled up along my driver's side so fast, it felt like I was standing still. My first thought was, who is this prick? But before I could even finish that thought, my mirror suddenly exploded with flashing lights like the 4th of July. The pickup had a set of red and blue LEDs mounted on top. My heart shot straight into my throat. Unmarked vehicles that always made me uneasy, and they still do. The lights were strobing so hard in my mirrors, it looked like a rave was happening behind me. I flipped on my hazard lights and started slowing down while looking for a place to pull over that wasn't just a tiny shoulder with a guardrail. Once my tires hit the rumble strip, I eased the truck over, setting the parking brake and placed my hands on the wheel at 10 and 2 the way I've been taught. When you're getting pulled over in a semi, you don't start reaching around the cab. That height difference makes cops nervous enough already. The driver of the pickup stepped out, wearing a tactical vest and a pistol belt. There was no state trooper hat, just a badge clipped onto the same belt as his holster. But I couldn't make out any details from where I sat. As he walked around my door like he owned the highway, my mind raced through every possible thing I might have done wrong. My logbook, my lights, my plates, my weight, even my IFTA sticker. I rolled down my window slowly. The man paused and glanced around inside the cab as if expecting to find someone hiding in the bunk. I greeted him politely and called him officer. When he asked for my license, registration, logbook, and medical card, I handed them over. While he was looking through them, I asked who he was with. Without even glancing up, he simply said, "State," and continued examining the paperwork. He only spent about 10 or 20 seconds looking at it, but it felt much longer. I sat there quietly with my hands on the wheel, hoping he'd say something simple like I had a broken tail light and then send me on my way. Instead, he told me to step out of the cab. He wanted to see inside my trailer. My stomach sank instantly. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I was still so new and terrified of making a mistake that might cost me my job or the respect of the other drivers. I put on my high visibility vest, climbed down, and walked with him to the back of the trailer. He instructed me to break the seal open, both doors, so we could see all the way to the nose. The way he spoke, using the right trucking terms, made it sound like he knew exactly what he was doing. Even though his uniform didn't show any insignia or name tag, and I didn't recognize the badge, I didn't question it. I pulled out my Gerber knife and cut through the plastic bolt seal. Number 782991K. I still remember that number. Like I'd been taught, I dropped the broken seal into my pocket. I opened the right door first, then the left, securing both doors against the trailer. The entire time, the man stood there watching with his arms crossed. I didn't even know exactly what I was hauling. My paperwork just said sporting goods. But the man didn't seem interested in the typical things an officer might check, like pallet spacing or load balance. I told him the bills were clean, no hazmat, nothing temperature controlled. He didn't respond. Instead, he started shining his flashlight between pallets, kicking at straps and checking along the walls as if he were searching for hidden compartments. I decided not to ask questions and simply stood there watching. Eventually, he finished inspecting the trailer and stepped back outside. I asked if I could close the door again, but I knew he'd need to give me paperwork explaining the broken seal first. Instead of answering, he asked if I had the truck keys on me. I told him they were still in the cab. He said to stay where I was and wait. That was the moment I started feeling irritated, though I kept my voice calm when I asked what was going on. He ignored the question. Then he placed 2 fingers in his mouth and blew a loud, sharp whistle. And that's when everything changed. Almost immediately, somewhere between a dozen and 15 men appeared from the nearby tree line and began running toward us. My heart nearly stopped. Instinctively, I started backing toward the cab. The man pulled his pistol and ordered me not to move. I froze, raising my hands. Running wasn't an option, and I didn't have any firearms on me. I wasn't licensed to carry one on long hauls anyway. The only thing that made me move again was when he ordered me to kneel. I didn't like that idea one bit. I actually told him no while continuing to back away. I'm oddly proud of that moment of defiance, even though it didn't last long. The man cocked his pistol and repeated the command. My knees seemed to give out on their own. Running might have given me a 20% chance of escape. Charging him would have been suicide. So I knelt down, placed my hands behind my head, and watched as he approached. He pressed the barrel of his pistol against my forehead. It was only then that the truth finally clicked. Even the worst state troopers wouldn't stick a gun against an innocent trucker's head. These men weren't police, and they definitely weren't government agents. Still, in that moment, I couldn't be completely sure. So I asked again, "Who the hell are you guys?" He didn't answer. Instead, he asked a question of his own. With the gun still pressed to my head, he asked if I was American. When I said yes, he asked if I was not just a citizen, but a real American. I don't even know what that meant. Still, I told him I was born and raised in New Jersey. For a moment, I wondered if this had something to do with immigration. But the expression on his face made it clear it was something more personal. Then he asked me my name. And after that, he asked me something that made my stomach twist. "Are you a Jew?" "I'm not Jewish. My father was born in New Jersey, but his parents were from Turkey, and I inherited some of their darker features." People had asked me that question before. The first time it happened, I had simply explained that my dad was Turkish Muslim. But in that moment, I knew saying that would be a terrible idea. So I thought quickly and told him my father was Greek Christian. It seemed like the safer answer. He still didn't look fully satisfied. After a moment, he nodded and finally offered a sort of explanation. He said that since I was a real American, I should be glad that he and his friends were taking the contents of my trailer. He told me to report the robbery exactly as it happened, so I wouldn't lose my job. According to him, the supplies weren't going to a worthy cause, and that even if it hurt me a little in the short term, it would benefit me in the long run. While he spoke, the men who had emerged from the woods were already unloading the trailer. Later, I learned that the sports goods I was hauling, including large amounts of ammunition, stacks of MREs, and even body armor. There was also hunting clothes and other gear, but those men seemed to know exactly which pallet they were after. Each of them carried 2 or 3 boxes before disappearing back into the trees. The man with the pistol kept it trained on me until the last of his companions vanished. Then he asked something that made my heart pound all over again. He asked if he needed to shoot me. If I was planning to run back to the track and grab a gun to play hero, he said he'd rather just shoot me now and save both of us the trouble. I told him the truth, that I didn't have one. He laughed and holstered his weapon. Then he said, I should consider getting something for protection. After ordering me to stay on my knees until he drove away, he walked back to the pickup, climbed inside, and sped off down the highway. As soon as I was able, I followed company procedure and contacted the police to report the robbery. After that, I called my route manager for a payphone to explain why my delivery would be both late and short. He actually laughed. He told me I was the first driver in the company to be robbed in over 20 years. I knew he was laughing mostly out of relief that I was alive and that the truck itself hadn't been stolen. To be honest, once the shock wore off, I felt a strange rush too. One minute I thought I was going to die. The next I was standing beside the highway smoking a cigarette and joking with police officers, photographing my trailer. Later, The authorities told me the men were most likely members of a militia group known as the Silent Brotherhood, active in the Pacific Northwest. They went on to commit several other crimes, robberies, and even killings. I've always considered myself lucky. Lucky that I walked away, because a few years later, they murdered a radio DJ who wasn't nearly as fortunate. Eventually, the FBI brought the Silent Brotherhood down. But there are plenty of other militias out there. Maybe not all of them are robbing trucks and killing people. Still, just knowing groups like that exist is enough to give me the chills. I was 13 the year my father failed to show up for our 4th of July reunion, the first and only time it ever happened. Every summer, our family gathered on my uncle's land outside Billings, Montana. The tradition never changed. Burgers hissed on the grill. Kids ran through the fields with sparklers. And once night settled, we lit fireworks that painted the sky red and gold. Afterward, everyone circled the bonfire, trading old family stories until the flames burned low. My dad, Ray Martinez, was a long-haul truck driver. No matter how far his route took him, he always managed to make it home for that reunion. As long as I could remember, he had never missed it. Until 2011. That year, he was hauling a refrigerated load of produce from Cheyenne, Wyoming to Bozeman, Montana. Normally, he would cut up the interstate through Casper and Billings, but wildfires had shut down several major routes. Dispatch rerouted him north through Cody and then west along Route 212, the Beartooth Highway. It was a longer drive, a lonelier one, and far more dangerous. Still, he promised he'd be home by July 3rd. When that day came and went, without a phone call, my mom did her best to act normal. She laughed at jokes, flipped burgers, and tried to keep the celebration going. But even at 13, I could sense the strain behind her smile. Years passed before I learned what really happened. It was a humid summer night in 2024 when Dad finally told me the full story. We were sitting on the back porch of my house in Billings while crickets chirped in the darkness. My own kids were asleep inside. Dad spoke slowly, like he was digging through memories he had buried long ago. What he told me explained every uneasy glance he'd given whenever someone mentioned Route 212. His story began just after midnight on July 2nd, 2011. He was descending a steep stretch of Route 212 near Clay Butte Lookout, thousands of feet above sea level. The road was recently washed out, leaving loose gravel scattered across the pavement. Then it happened. The trailer suddenly swung wide. The entire rig lurched violently as the wheels lost traction. Dad fought the steering wheel, but the massive Freightliner, Cascadia, slid sideways off the shoulder. The truck plunged into dry brush and loose dirt just below the road. The impact shook him badly, but he wasn't injured. Heart racing, he climbed down from the cab with a flashlight in his shaking hand and inspected the damage. The truck had sunk deep into the dirt, tilted at an angle, the heavy trailer dragging the whole rig downward. It wasn't going anywhere. There was no cell signal that high in the mountains. The highway had almost no traffic because of the wildfire closures. So I figured my best option, Dad told me quietly, was to wait for daylight and flag somebody down. He climbed back into the sleeper cab and tried to sleep, convincing himself it was just a temporary setback. But when he woke up, everything had changed. The clock read 3:40 a.m. The air inside the cab was so cold he could see his breath, which made no sense for a July night. Even stranger, the truck's engine had shut off sometime while he slept. He slid into the driver's seat and turned the key. Instead of the usual rumble, a harsh metallic shriek echoed from under the hood. Warning lights flashed across the dashboard, filling the cab with flickering red and yellow. Dad climbed down again and popped the hood. The smell hit him first, a sharp chemical odor that burned his nose. Then he saw the damage. The oil pan had been ripped open, not dented or cracked, but torn open, as if something sharp had deliberately crawled through the metal. Thick oil had dripped onto the gravel, mixing with coolant and forming dark pools beneath the engine. That's when he noticed the footprints. They were pressed into the dirt beside the truck. Bare, human-shaped, but longer than they should have been. They led away from the truck toward the trees. I thought maybe someone else was stranded, Dad told me. Someone desperate enough to mess with the engine trying to get help. Then he heard movement. Something fast. Too fast. He caught a glimpse of a figure slipping around the back of the trailer. It moved upright like a person, he said, pausing to take a slow drink from his glass. But faster. Smoother. That was enough. Dad scrambled back into the cab, locked the doors, and pulled the pistol from underneath the seat. He sat perfectly still in the driver's chair, listening. Minutes crawled by. At 4:12 a.m., he heard footsteps. They were moving across the top of the trailer. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The aluminum roof creaked softly under the weight as the steps crossed toward the front, until they stopped directly above the cab. Then, there was nothing. Complete silence. Dad gripped the pistol in sweaty hands, staring upward. I don't know what to do, he whispered when telling me the story. Couldn't shoot through the roof. Couldn't just sit there forever either. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him back into sleep. But what came next was worse than any nightmare. He woke suddenly, gasping for air, heart pounding violently in his chest. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then reality sank back in. He was still stranded en route 212. His phone screen read 12:08 a.m. That made no sense. The last time he'd checked the clock, after the footsteps, it had been 4:12. His mind felt foggy. Outside the cab, the darkness seemed thicker than normal, swallowing the faint glow of the phone. The nightmare he had just escaped clung to his thoughts. In the dream, he had wandered through a warped forest where trees bent at impossible angles and roots twisted like dead snakes. Strange clicking sounds echoed everywhere, and unseen eyes watched from behind every trunk. At the center of the forest stood a grotesque totem made from charred wood and bones. Just before he woke up, something had stepped out from behind it. Tall, misshapen, its face stretched between agony and a terrible grin. Dad forced the image from his mind and wiped sweat from his face. Then something moved outside the driver's window. He turned his head slowly. Two eyes stared back at him. A face was pressed against the glass. It looked almost human, but wrong. The skin was pale and tight across the bones beneath. The cheekbones were too long, the forehead too tall, the jaw crooked in an unnatural way. And the eyes, they were wide and dark, reflecting the faint light from inside the cab. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Dad's lungs froze. The pistol lay inches away on the passenger seat. Finally, adrenaline broke the paralysis. He grabbed the gun and fired. The explosion shattered the silence as the window burst outward in a spray of glass. His ears rang violently. When he looked again, the face was gone. No body, no blood, nothing. Just darkness and the quiet mountain night. Cold air poured through the shattered window, carrying a faint smell of sulfur and burnt metal. Dad checked his phone again. 12:13 a.m. Only 5 minutes had passed, but it had felt like hours. He climbed carefully from the seat and peered through the broken window. The dirt beside the truck was perfectly smooth. No footprints, no disturbance. As if nothing had ever been there. Shaken, he retreated into the sleeper and wrapped his bleeding hand with a rag. Time felt wrong now. Minutes stretched endlessly while the clock barely moved. Something was happening that he couldn't explain. Eventually, exhaustion dragged him back to sleep again. When he woke up next, he wasn't in the truck. He was standing barefoot in the woods. The ground was cold and rocky beneath his feet. Towering trees surrounded him, trees he didn't recognize. His truck was gone. Worse still, he had left the pistol behind. The forest was silent. No insects, no wind. Then something moved behind him. Branches snapped. Something large pushed through the brush with slow, measured steps. Dad turned toward the sound, but saw only flashes of movement darting between the trees. Then instinct took over. He ran. Branches clawed at his arms and faces while he sprinted blindly through the darkness, tripping over roots and fallen logs. His lungs burned as panic drove him deeper into the woods. Finally, he burst into a clearing. A small log cabin stood there, smoke curling from the chimney. Dad staggered onto the porch and pounded on the door. "Help!" he shouted. After several seconds, the door opened. An old man stood there, holding a shotgun. "What the hell's going on here?" he demanded. "My truck, it wrecked," Dad gasped. "Something's chasing me." The man studied him briefly, then stepped aside. "Well, get in." Inside, the cabin smelled of wood, smoke, and coffee. The man set his shotgun aside and introduced himself as Jonas. Dad told him everything. The crash, the torn engine, the pale face at the window, the lost hours. Jonas listened without interrupting. When Dad finished, the old man pulled an old journal from a shelf. "You ever heard of the apothecary?" Jonas asked. Dad shook his head. "Stories say they were here long before settlers," Jonas explained. "A secretive group that practiced things people stopped talking about generations ago." He closed the journal slowly. They weren't alone out there. They made things, changed themselves maybe. What things? Dad asked. Jonas looked him straight in the eyes. The wrong ones. Mimics. According to the stories, they looked human enough to fool people, but they weren't human anymore. Why me? Dad whispered. Jonas shrugged grimly. Sometimes folks just cross the wrong place at the wrong time. He warned Dad that these things could twist memory and distort time. Can you stop them? Dad asked. Jonas shook his head. You don't stop them. You just hope they lose interest. They stayed in the cabin until sunrise. When morning light returned, Jonas walked Dad back toward the road. The truck was still there, but now it was completely destroyed. Doors ripped open, tires shredded, engine gutted, nothing stolen, just deliberate ruin. Jonas helped him climb to higher ground, where they could finally get a signal and call for help. Before the rescue truck arrived, the old man handed Dad a small piece of bark with writing carved into it. Whatever you do, Jonas warned, don't come back here. Dad promised. But even as he left, he realized that there were still hours from that night he couldn't remember. 13 years passed. Life moved on. The memories dulled until they felt almost like a bad dream. Then, one night in 2024, after my son's birthday party, Dad and I sat on the porch drinking whiskey. Out of nowhere, I asked him a question. Did you ever see anything on the road that really scared you? He hesitated for a long time. Then he told me everything. When he finished, I asked why he had never mentioned it before. Because if I talked about it, he said quietly, it meant it was real. Later that night, he went inside and returned with a small piece of bark. He handed it to me. Written on it were faded words. Don't call them, don't follow them. If they stop watching you, walk. Don't run, don't think. I asked him what don't think meant. He shook his head. Maybe the less attention you give them, the less power they have. We sat in silence after that. Eventually, I went inside. Dad stayed on the porch. Later, he told me he looked up satellite images of Route 212 on his phone, the road he had never driven again. He realized then how much he had changed his life just to avoid that highway. Before going to bed, he stepped back outside one last time and looked toward the dark woods beyond our fence. He said he felt certain about one thing. Whatever he countered that night hadn't wanted to kill him. It had simply been curious. The way a child studies an insect trapped under glass. And curiosity like that is not human. Dad locked the door, turned out the lights, and went upstairs. As he drifted to sleep, he knew something was absolute certainty. The fear he carried for 13 years wasn't paranoia. It had been earned, and no matter what happened in the future, he would never drive Route 212 again. For decades, I've hauled freight across the country, logging more interstates and back roads than I could ever tally. Most of the strangest moments come after dark, when the highways empty out and the nights turn everything quiet and strange, especially down in the southwestern deserts. There's an otherworldly feel to that landscape. Vast open spaces, an endless sky, and winds that seem to murmur secrets you can't quite catch. I've spotted odd things out there. Silhouettes standing motionless in the shrub, staring into nothing, or shape shifting just beyond the reach of my headlights. Once, I even glimpsed a long chain of figures crawling on all fours beside the pavement, stretching into the distance like some endless silent march. Unsettling? Sure, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered one dawn near the Mexican border. It was around 2010. I was on a regular run, paralleling the frontier for miles, a stretch notorious for cartel trouble. Every trucker on that route knew the score. Stay alert, keep the CB humming, share intel on anything sketchy ahead. The radio was our lifeline. Warnings about vehicles running dark high-speed pursuits, or worse. Most nights it stayed quiet, just crackling static and miles of nothing. But every so often, someone would report lights-off tails, reckless drivers, or gunfire echoing in the distance. That particular night felt routine. I had done the drive so often it was automatic. I had my favorite hidden pull-off, a dusty wash tucked between faded billboards, leading to a narrow gully where the rig vanished from the highway. Arizona wilderness, pure isolation. Stars blazed overhead. I eased in, killed the engine, ate something cold from the cooler, and watched the sky fade before crawling into the sleeper for rest. I drifted off mid-movie, only to jerk awake to a heavy bang against the trailer, like something solid struck it. I froze, ears straining. Footsteps crunched outside, slow and deliberate. I slipped to the driver's seat and stared through the windshield into pitch black. Shapes moved faintly, then stillness. No more steps. I told myself it was wildlife, a javelina or coyote, and tried to settle back down. Sleep was creeping in again when a scream ripped through the quiet. Distant at first, raw and anguished, like someone in agony. Then another, and another, each seeming nearer, as if the source was approaching. My pulse hammered. Voices followed. Dozens overlapped in frantic, pleading tones. Words were lost to the wind and distance, but the desperation cut clear. Then, abruptly, everything ceased. The silence that rushed in felt heavier, like the desert had devoured the sand. I don't know what possessed me, but I flicked the high beams on and off 3 times. Maybe signaling help, maybe just reflex. The lights pierced the dark, revealing only empty sand and scrub. Nothing. I grabbed the CB mic, voice unsteady, and hailed anyone listening. Static hissed, then a reply. "Yeah, that's you? See anything weird?" I described the screams, the voices, a pause, then low and tense. "Friend, stay put." I just dodged rounds from some bastards running blacked out. Cars tearing up and down the road, hunting. "Whatever you heard, steer clear. It ain't safe." I thanked him, signed off, and sat rigid in the dark, The night stayed mute. Sleep never really returned. Those cries looped in my head. At first light, I was up and moving fast, eager to put distance between me and that spot. I ran my checks, stepped out, and froze. 20 feet from the cab sat a wide, dark stain in the dirt. Fresh blood, soaked deep into the sand. Too much for any animal squirmish. I edged closer. No paw prints, no drag marks, just the puddle. A chill crawled up my spine. The truck looked untouched, so I fired it up, backed out of the gully, and hit the dirt track. That's when the debris started. Bits of clothing at first, shreds of shirts, jeans, a lone shoe, scattered like litter. Then more blood, smears on rocks, splashes on creosote bushes. Pools of it trailed along the path. And then the remains, dismembered, hands, feet, scalps, chunks of flesh, tangled with the torn fabric, strewn carelessly across the ground like discarded trash. The stench slammed into me, coppery blood mixed with early rot. I braked hard, hand trembling. My stomach lurched. I couldn't look anymore, but I couldn't stay. I keyed the CB, voice breaking, calling for anyone. Responses came quick. Other drivers, all rattled. "Yeah, it's bad out there," one said. "Word spreading. Big hit last night. Cartel stuff. They're already calling it the Mother's Day Massacre on the news." I'd heard cartel horror stories before, but this felt different, more savage. I shifted into gear and rolled forward, eyes fixed ahead, refusing to glance at the rear view. Miles later, something else struck me. The silence wasn't just absence of screams anymore. No birds called, no insects buzzed, not even a whisper of wind through the spines. The whole desert held perfectly still, as if the earth itself was stunned, waiting. The radio sparked again. A new voice, unfamiliar. "This is Jawbreaker. You still out there? Did you see him?" I didn't reply. I just kept driving. The images seared behind my eyes, and the quiet pressing in heavier than ever. I've always stuck to the familiar loops, regional deliveries that kept me within a few hours of home. No endless cross-country marathons, no racing the dawn across state lines. I like the predictability. Same highways, same exits, same diners where the waitresses already know my coffee order. It feels safer that way. This particular load was routine, just a quiet snake through Royal Georgia on one of those narrow two-lane roads that look like they haven't been repaved since the 1950s. Cracked asphalt, faded center lines barely clinging to life. Dense pine and oak crowded right up to the white edge. Branches reaching overhead like they wanted to close the canopy completely. The hills rose and fell in gentle rolling rhythm, almost alive under the tires. Pretty country in a lonesome, forgotten sort of way. But tight turns and blind dips make it hell on the loaded trailer. You have to stay sharp, hands firm, eyes scanning every shadow. By late afternoon, the light was turning gold and heavy. I was already worn thin, fighting yawns, stomach grumbling. I decided not to push it after dark. Those curves get treacherous when you can't see what's coming. Luck was with me. A wide gravel turnout appeared just when I needed it. Plenty of room to swing the rig in without blocking traffic. I eased off the road, tires popping over loose stone, angled the nose so I could see anyone approaching and bolt if necessary. Old habit. I've parked in worse spots and rougher places, but something about this quiet stretch felt off. Too still, too watchful. I shook it off, fatigue playing tricks, and told myself I was just tired. I climbed into the sleeper, grabbed a sandwich from the cooler, chewed slowly while thumbing through my phone. The night settled around the truck, leaves whispering, crickets starting up, nothing else. No headlights, no CB chatter, just the gentle creak of cooling metal. My eyes grew heavy. I stretched out, found a position that didn't hurt my back, and started to drift. Then nature called, loud and insistent. I grumbled, rolled off the bunk, reached for the door handle. That's when I noticed the mirror. A car had slipped in behind me. No lights, engine idling, so low it was almost inaudible beneath the night sounds. Just sitting there, watching. I froze, half bent in the doorway, staring into the glass. No flash of high beams, no friendly tap on the horn, like another driver looking for space. Just darkness and that patient rumble. My pulse kicked up, every internal alarm screaming that this wasn't right. I eased back inside without a sound, double-checked both locks, slid the aluminum bat from its spot beside the seat into easy reach. The little .22 in the glove stayed where it was. Too noisy, too small for real trouble, but the bat felt solid in my hand. Minutes crawled. 5, 10. The car never moved. No doors open. No one got out to stretch or smoke. They were waiting. I cracked the side curtains just enough to peek. Dark sedan, black or navy, hard to tell. Windows tinted, solid. Nothing visible inside. Then the engine died. Driver's door opened slowly. A figure stepped out. Tall, thin, face hidden in shadow. He moved out of sight toward the passenger side. Second door, second man. Footsteps now deliberate, gravel crunching in slow circles around the truck. One on the driver's side, one on the passenger's. A soft metallic scrape. Someone testing a handle. Locked. A pause. The other side. Another tug. Locked. My heart slammed against my ribs. If I made a single noise, they'd know I was awake. If they knew I was awake, they might escalate. Smash glass, pry a door, rush me before I could react. I stayed statue still, listening to their breathing, heavy and close. Then I remembered the slight downhill slope I'd parked on. Air brakes, neutral, let gravity do the work. They'd parked directly behind me. 45 seconds, maybe less, before 20 tons of steel kissed their hood. Enough to panic them, enough to buy me space. I inched forward, silent as I could manage. fingers closing around the parking brake lever. Deep breath, pulled. The truck groaned, sighed, began to creep backward. Immediate reaction, sharp scuffle of boots on gravel, a hissed curse, footsteps retreating fast. I kept one foot hovering over the service brake, ready to stop short of an actual collision. I wasn't trying to crush anyone. I just wanted them gone. And it worked. They scrambled back to their car, engine roared awake. Headlights stabbed on, blinding in the mirror. Tires spun, kicking dust. They reversed hard, whipped around, and tore off down the road, taillights shrinking fast. I stomped the brake, halting the roll. Then, maybe stupidly, I popped the door, stepped down onto the gravel, bat in hand. Adrenaline singing in my veins. They'd stopped maybe 50 yards away, two silhouettes in the front seat. Not kids, not locals out joyriding. Grown men. Skinny, tall, wearing cheap plastic masks. One a grinning skull, the other plain white featureless. The driver lifted a hand, middle finger. Then they spun tires again and vanished into the dark. I stood there breathing hard, watching the dust settle until the night swallowed their lights completely. Back inside, I locked everything twice, sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel until my forearms ached. Sleep wasn't happening. I watched the mirrors until the eastern sky began to pale, waiting for headlights to reappear. They never did. At first light, I fired the engine and got out of there. No inspection of the trailer, no looking for footprints, just drive. 25 miles later, I rolled into a tiny crossroads town. Gas pump, diner, not much else. I parked, climbed out on shaky legs, went inside and asked to use the landline. The old man behind the counter gave me a look, but slid the phone over. Sheriff's department answered quick. I told them everything. The turnout, the dark car, the two men, the masks, the slow circling, the door handles test, the rollback that sent them running. A deputy listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a short silence. "Yes," he said finally. "That sounds like the Foster boys." He explained. Local troublemakers, mostly petty theft, but they targeted a few overnight truckers. Figured sleepers were easy marks. Slip in, grab valuables, maybe hit the trailer too. Gone before anyone stirred. I asked the question that had been burning since the moment they fled. What if I hadn't woken up? Another pause. Can't say for sure. They're cowards more than killers. Probably just would have cleaned you out, probably. Probably. I thanked him, hung up, bought coffee and a plate of eggs. I barely tasted, then sat in the booth staring at nothing while the sun climbed. When I finally pulled back onto the highway, the world looked ordinary again. Bright, open, pines glittering with dew. But I kept checking the mirrors. Every side road, every parked car, every shadow that moved. For the rest of that run, I only stopped at busy places. Truck stops with lights and people and cameras. If a lot looked empty, I kept rolling. Every parking spot I chose was under floodlights, close to the building, doors triple checked. That happened years ago. I never saw that sedan again. Never had another night quite like it. But out here, when the road stretches empty and the trees press close, you remember how small your little circle of light really is. Just a single dot on a long black ribbon. And sometimes something watches that dot, waiting for it to flicker out. And that, dear listeners, brings a close to these true creepy trucker stories. I'd like to take a moment and acknowledge the rest of the members of Back to Ashes. Thank you all so much for remaining supportive and dedicated to this channel. I can't thank you enough. And as I always say, without you, I wouldn't have this voice, and Back to Ashes would not be what it is. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you kindly. If you are sleeping, I hope Slumberland is treating you comfortably. If you are awake, I hope you've enjoyed these selections. In the meantime, please stay vigilant and look after yourselves. I'll be reading to you soon. Have yourselves a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. Peace, love, and light to you all.